The FBI committed fraud on a foreign government's judiciary. This is not alleged. This is in the court record of the United States federal appeals system, acknowledged by federal prosecutors, confirmed by the Canadian government in a formal diplomatic protest to the U.S. State Department. They fabricated sworn affidavits. They submitted them to Canadian courts. They got their man extradited. And then the woman who signed those affidavits told the truth. She had never met the man she claimed to witness, had been coerced by the agents who wrote the statements she signed, and the FBI had known this when they submitted the documents to Canada. He served 48 years. There's a memo in the FBI's own COINTELPRO files that describes an Indigenous civil rights organization as a terrorist threat, a designation applied without a single terrorism charge ever being filed. There's a 2-year period on a South Dakota reservation when 64 people are killed, and the FBI investigates none of them. There is a ballistics report the government used to convict a man that its own prosecutor later admits cannot establish what the prosecution claimed it established. The part I could not set down, the specific detail that stopped the research cold, is that Canada formally protested to the State Department in writing, and nothing happened. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and drop a like. The algorithm actively buries this kind of content. The story begins in 1968 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in a city that is about to produce something the FBI will spend the next decade trying to destroy. Event 1. What was AIM, the American Indian Movement, 1968-1972? Minneapolis in the summer of 1968 is a city with a specific, documented problem. Native Americans who have migrated from reservations to the city under the federal relocation programs of the 1950s, programs designed to move Indigenous people off reservation land by offering them bus tickets to urban centers and the promise of employment assistance, are being systematically targeted by the Minneapolis Police Department. The targeting is documented in the complaints filed by Native residents and in the subsequent investigations of community organizations that track it. Native men picked up on minor charges, held for days, beaten in custody, charged with crimes that disappear without prosecution, but produce records that follow them through the city's social service and employment systems. The American Indian community in Minneapolis has no institutional mechanism to respond to it. In July 1968, a group of Native activists meets in the basement of a church in Minneapolis. Among them are Dennis Banks, a member of the Ojibwe Nation who has spent time in federal prison and has come out with a specific analysis of what Native communities need that is not available from the existing advocacy organizations. Clyde Bellecourt, also Ojibwe, who has organized inside prison and brought those skills to community organizing, and George Mitchell. They call what they are forming the American Indian Movement. Its first organized action is a street patrol, Native volunteers with two-way radios monitoring police activity in Native neighborhoods, documenting arrests, providing witnesses, and following patrol cars to ensure the men taken into custody arrive at the station without having been beaten in transit. The patrol works. Police misconduct complaints in the areas where AIM patrols operate drop measurably in the first year of the program. AIM chapters spread to Denver, to Cleveland, to San Francisco, to the reservation communities of the Dakotas and the Northern Plains. The organization shifts from an urban police accountability project to a broader civil rights movement for Native Americans, drawing on the energy of the broader 1960s activist climate while addressing the specific, particular conditions of Indigenous communities that differ fundamentally from those of the Black civil rights movement, the specific legal relationship between Native nations and the United States government, the reservation system, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The treaty violations, the land theft that is ongoing rather than historical. By 1972, AIM is a national organization. It has organized the Trail of Broken Treaties Caravan, a cross-country march of Native activists and community members that ends at the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. in the week before the 1972 presidential election. The BIA building is occupied. Files are taken. AIM leadership argues that the files document treaty violations and federal misconduct and belong to the communities they concern. The FBI characterizes the occupation as a criminal act and the files as stolen government property. The internal assessment the Bureau produces in the wake of the BIA occupation is the document that establishes the institutional posture that will govern the FBI's relationship to AIM for the next decade. The assessment designates AIM as a domestic terrorist organization. It makes this designation without citing a single federal terrorism charge ever filed against any AIM member. It makes it based on the organization's rhetoric, its confrontational tactics, and the FBI's assessment of its potential for future violence. An assessment produced by the same bureau that is about to begin a classified suppression campaign designed to ensure that potential is realized in ways the bureau can exploit. The FBI's 1972 domestic terrorist designation of AIM is in the bureau's COINTELPRO files, released through FOIA litigation in the 1980s and 1990s. The designation is not publicly announced. It is not reviewed by any court. It is an internal classification that authorizes the entire operational apparatus the Bureau is about to deploy against an organization that, at the moment of designation, has not been charged with terrorism by any jurisdiction in the United States. AIM is designated a terrorist organization. The designation is classified. Its members do not know it exists. The operations authorized by it begin immediately. The FBI had done this before. The only thing new about what it does to AIM is the target. The specific policy context in which the FBI's 1972 AIM designation occurs is worth establishing clearly, because it connects the AIM campaign to the broader apparatus of domestic political suppression that COINTELPRO represents. COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, runs officially from 1956 to 1971 and targets, in sequence, the Communist Party USA, socialist and left organizations, the Ku Klux Klan, black nationalist organizations including the Black Panther Party, and the broad anti-Vietnam War movement. By the time it is officially terminated in 1971, it has produced documented operations that include the assassination facilitation of Black Panther Party leader Fred Hampton in Chicago in December 1969, the systematic disruption of Martin Luther King Jr.'s organizations through forged letters and surveillance, and the placement of informants inside virtually every significant left political organization in the United States. The 1971 termination does not end the FBI's domestic suppression activities. It ends the administrative designation under which they are organized. The tools, informants, disinformation, prosecutorial harassment, coordinated surveillance with local law enforcement continue to be deployed, now under different administrative categories and with less centralized paper trail. The AIM campaign is the clearest documented example of post-COINTELPRO, the same method applied to a new target through administrative mechanisms that are technically distinct from the classified program that generated the congressional scrutiny that forced the 1971 announcement. AIM's rapid growth between 1968 and 1972 is the specific trigger for the Bureau's escalating attention. An organization that begins as a Minneapolis Police Accountability Patrol and within 4 years has chapters across the country, has organized a national march to Washington, and has occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in the nation's capital, is, in the FBI's institutional assessment, exactly the kind of organizational formation that COINTELPRO is designed to prevent from reaching mature political effectiveness. The AIM leadership, Banks, Means, Bellecourt, and others, are the targets of an operation that the Bureau designs before it has evidence that any of them have committed a crime, and continues to run after that absence of evidence is established in courtroom after courtroom through the early 1970s. The specific legal terrain that makes AIM vulnerable to the FBI's campaign is the reservation system itself. The Pine Ridge Reservation is federal land. The federal government has jurisdiction over major crimes committed on reservation land through the Major Crimes Act. The FBI has authority to investigate on reservations that it does not have in ordinary municipal or county jurisdictions. This authority, designed to protect indigenous communities from crimes the federal government has treaty obligations to address, becomes, in the Pine Ridge of the early 1970s, the instrument of the Bureau's presence in a community it is not protecting but suppressing. Event 2, COINTELPRO Comes 4 AIM, 1970 to 1974. The Counterintelligence Program, COINTELPRO, is officially terminated by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover in April 1971, 3 weeks after a group of activists calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI breaks into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania and steals 800 documents, several of which describe COINTELPRO operations in language specific enough that newspapers publish them and Congress begins asking questions. Hoover ends the program to end the scrutiny. The program ends, the methods do not. By 1972, the FBI is running against AIM, an operation that is, in every meaningful operational respect, a continuation of COINTELPRO under a different administrative designation. The COINTELPRO files on AIM, released through FOIA litigation pursued by AIM attorneys and investigative journalists across the 1980s and 1990s, document the specific tools the Bureau deploys. Informants are placed inside AIM chapters. The informant's role is not merely to report, it is to disrupt. FBI field directives, recovered in post-conviction proceedings in the Peltier case and in parallel FOIA litigation, specifically authorize informants to take actions designed to neutralize AIM leadership, to create conflicts between leaders, to spread disinformation within the organization, to create the conditions for internal fractures that would reduce AIM's operational effectiveness. The specific informants the FBI places inside AIM are documented in court records produced through the Peltier post-conviction proceedings. One of them, a man named Douglas Durham, rises to become AIM's Director of Security, the person responsible for identifying and protecting AIM leadership from exactly the kind of FBI infiltration that he himself represents. Durham is a white man who claims native heritage he does not have. He is recruited by the FBI in 1973. He provides the Bureau with detailed intelligence about AIM's internal organization, leadership movements, financial accounts, and planned actions. He is unmasked in 1975 after a journalist confronts AIM leadership with evidence of his FBI connections. By then he has spent 2 years as the security director of the organization he is informing on. The disinformation operations run alongside the infiltration. Internal AIM documents, memoranda, correspondence, financial records are forged or altered and distributed within the organization to create suspicion between leaders. The FBI's field directives on AIM, several of which are recovered through FOIA requests by attorney Bruce Ellison during the Peltier post-conviction proceedings, describe specific disinformation operations by name and by method. The operations are designed to make AIM leaders suspect each other of being FBI informants, a strategy that simultaneously creates internal conflict, and when real informants are subsequently identified, produces a climate of suspicion so generalized that the specific FBI assets still inside the organization are harder to isolate. The harassment of individual AIM leaders is also documented. Dennis Banks, AIM's co-founder, is arrested multiple times on charges that are subsequently dropped or result in acquittals, but that require him to spend time in custody, raise money for legal defense, and divert organizational attention to his cases. Russell Means, another AIM leader, faces multiple prosecutions in the early 1970s. The FBI's internal communications, produced through FOIA requests, describe these prosecutions as instruments of the disruption campaign, not as independent law enforcement actions, but as operational components of the effort to neutralize AIM's leadership. The cover of this campaign is maintained through the simple mechanism of institutional denial. The FBI does not publicly acknowledge the AIM operations. When AIM attorneys allege FBI infiltration and harassment in court proceedings, the Bureau's official response is that it conducts lawful law enforcement activities in response to criminal conduct and does not target organizations for their political beliefs. This position is maintained until the FOIA litigation of the 1980s and 1990s produces the field directives themselves. No FBI supervisor is disciplined for the AIM COINTELPRO operations. Several of the agents most directly involved in the campaign against AIM continue their careers in the Bureau without consequence. The disruption operations they run do not end with the 1975 Pine Ridge firefight, they run through the entire decade. But 1975 is when they produce consequences that cannot be classified away. The specific human cost of the FBI's AIM disruption campaign is documented in the cases of individuals whose lives are directly affected by the Bureau's informant placement and disinformation operations. Douglas Durham's 2 years as AIM's Director of Security, the period during which he provides the FBI with detailed intelligence about AIM's internal operations, while nominally protecting the organization from exactly the kind of infiltration he represents, produces consequences that extend beyond the intelligence he delivers. Durham's position inside AIM means that the security protocols AIM develops during those 2 years are protocols he designs and that he can, simultaneously, help the FBI circumvent. The AIM members who trust Durham with sensitive organizational information trust it to a man who passes it directly to the Bureau. The operational security of the organization, its ability to protect its members, its leadership, and its supporters from the FBI surveillance it knows is occurring, is compromised at its most sensitive level. The broader disinformation operation, the forged letters, the altered documents, the planted rumors designed to make AIM leaders suspect each other of being FBI informants, produces a climate of internal suspicion that has lethal consequences. Anna Miakwash's death in 1976, which the subsequent investigation attributes to an AIM internal killing motivated by the belief that she is an FBI informant, occurs in a context that the FBI's disinformation operations directly create. The Bureau runs operations designed to make AIM members suspect each other of being FBI informants. The operations succeed in creating that suspicion. A woman is killed because of it. Whether the FBI intends this specific outcome or produces it as the foreseeable consequence of its operations is a question the documented record does not fully resolve, but the causal chain between the disinformation and the death is documented in the subsequent investigations of Akwash's killing. The prosecution of AIM leaders that follows Wounded Knee is documented in statistical terms that reveal its function. More than 500 people are indicted on charges related to the Wounded Knee occupation. The overwhelming majority of these charges are eventually dropped or result in acquittals. The legal process produces 3 convictions out of more than 500 prosecutions. By the government's own trial record, the Wounded Knee occupation does not constitute the criminal enterprise the FBI characterizes it as. But the prosecutorial machinery achieves its operational purpose. AIM spends years and enormous organizational resources on legal defense. Its leaders are repeatedly arrested and held through bail proceedings that drain the organization's finances, and the sustained legal pressure fragments the organization's ability to operate in the communities it is built to serve. What they build in those years is the context for everything that happens next. You cannot understand Pine Ridge without understanding what the FBI was doing on Pine Ridge before June 26, 1975. And you cannot understand that without going back to the treaty that made the reservation what it was and the man the U.S. government installed to run it. Event 3. The RCMP connection, 2 agencies, 1 target, 1970–1975. AIM's operations do not stop at the United States border. The organization has members and supporters in Canadian Indigenous communities. It draws on the same networks of cross-border Indigenous political organizing that have existed across the 49th parallel since long before the border itself was drawn, networks that connected the Lakota Nation to communities in Canada, that allowed AIM members to travel between the 2 countries for organizing, for legal refuge, and for solidarity work with Canadian First Nations groups pursuing parallel land rights and civil rights campaigns. When AIM members move across the border, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Canada's national police force, which also functions as an intelligence agency, is watching. The RCMP Security Service, the intelligence division of the RCMP, maintains surveillance files on AIM beginning in the early 1970s. The RCMP's justification for this surveillance is the presence of AIM members in Canada and the organization's cross-border activities. The surveillance is not publicly disclosed. It is conducted in the classified mode that national security investigations take in both countries. The newly declassified RCMP files surfaced in 2024 through CBC reporting and through RCMP access to information requests processed over years of litigation, establish something more specific than parallel surveillance. They establish coordination. The files contain references to intelligence sharing arrangements between the RCMP Security Service and the FBI. They contain references to joint assessments of AIM's cross-border activities. They establish that the two agencies are not conducting independent surveillance operations that happen to have the same target. They are sharing operational intelligence about the same targets through formal intelligence sharing channels. The specific mechanism of the intelligence sharing is documented in the RCMP files in terms that are clearer in some respects than in others. The files confirm that the RCMP receives and uses FBI intelligence assessments about AIM members who cross into Canada. The files confirm that RCMP surveillance information about AIM members in Canada is shared with American counterparts. The files reference joint meetings between RCMP and FBI officials on the AIM question. What the files do not establish, at least in the portions that have been released, is the full operational scope of what the two agencies do with their shared intelligence. That question is partially answered by what happens in 1975 when Leonard Peltier crosses the border. The Canadian government's posture toward AIM is shaped by its own domestic political context. Canada in the early 1970s is in the middle of its own crisis of Indigenous rights. The 1969 White Paper, which proposes to abolish the legal status of First Nations and Indian reserves, has generated massive Indigenous political mobilization that produces its withdrawal but leaves the underlying tensions unresolved. The RCMP's surveillance of AIM is partly a response to the organization's actual cross-border activities and partly a response to the RCMP's concern that AIM's organizing model might influence Canadian Indigenous political movements in directions the RCMP considers destabilizing. The FBI's interest in Canada is more specific and more operational. The Bureau wants to be able to reach AIM members who cross the border. It wants to know where they go, who they meet, and when they can be reached. The RCMP's surveillance infrastructure, extended by its institutional reach into Canadian Indigenous communities, provides the FBI with exactly that capability. The two agencies are not running parallel operations. They are running a joint one against the same people across an international border. This arrangement has a specific consequence that is documented in detail, and that is the centerpiece of this story. When Leonard Peltier crosses into Canada in February 1976, the RCMP knows he is there. The FBI knows the RCMP knows. What follows is not a standard extradition proceeding between two allied nations operating in good faith through established legal channels. It is the operational endpoint of a multi-year joint surveillance operation, and it requires, to complete, a piece of documentary fabrication that will become the most documented government fraud in the history of American extradition law. The specific channels through which the FBI and RCMP coordinate are documented in the RCMP files in terms that are clearer about the existence of coordination than about its precise mechanisms. The files contain references to liaison with American counterparts that intelligence historians interpret as formal intelligence sharing arrangements of the kind that operate between allied national security agencies under bilateral cooperation agreements. These agreements, which exist in various forms between the intelligence agencies of the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, collectively known as the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Network, authorize the exchange of intelligence about shared targets without requiring the formal legal processes that govern law enforcement cooperation. The significance of this intelligence sharing channel for the Peltier story is that it creates a legal ambiguity in the extradition proceedings that the FBI exploits. The extradition request is formally a legal proceeding, a request from one government's judicial process to another's, governed by the U.S.-Canada Extradition Treaty and requiring evidentiary presentation to a Canadian court. But the underlying operational context is an intelligence operation, a joint FBI-RCMP surveillance and identification effort that already knows where Peltier is and has been sharing that information through intelligence channels before the formal legal process begins. The extradition is the legal endpoint of an intelligence operation. The legal process is dressed up to look like it begins from a position of neutral good faith, when in fact the two governments have been running a coordinated operation against the man being extradited for years. This context matters for understanding why the FBI fabricates the Poor Bear affidavits. The Bureau does not fabricate them because it lacks other evidence. It has the Pine Ridge investigation files and whatever the two agents' investigation produces before the firefight. It fabricates them because the legal standard for extradition requires a specific form of evidence, eyewitness testimony or its equivalent, that the Bureau's actual files do not clearly contain in a form admissible in a Canadian court. The fabrication is not born of desperation. It is born of operational efficiency. The Bureau needs a specific form of evidence for a specific legal process. It does not have that evidence in genuine form, and it manufactures it. The RCMP's role in this process is documented in the declassified files at the level of intelligence sharing rather than at the level of the affidavit fabrication itself. The RCMP files do not establish that Canadian officials know the Poor Bear affidavits are false when they are submitted to the Canadian court. What the files establish is that the RCMP is a participant in the operational framework within which the extradition occurs, a framework in which both agencies are working toward the same operational goal, Peltier's return to U.S. custody, through a combination of intelligence methods and legal processes that are not as separate as the formal extradition proceeding suggests. The story of what happens in Canada in 1976 requires understanding what happens in South Dakota in 1975, and that story begins in 1973 at Wounded Knee. The specific legal significance of what the RCMP FBI intelligence sharing channel means for the extradition proceeding is a dimension of the case that the 2024 RCMP disclosures bring in a sharper focus than any previous documentation has permitted. Under the U.S.-Canada extradition treaty as it operates in 1976, the requesting government is required to present to a Canadian court evidence that establishes a prima facie case for the offense charged. The Canadian court is supposed to evaluate that evidence independently, to act as a neutral judicial body assessing whether the legal standard for extradition is met, separate from the political relationship between the two governments. The RCMP FBI intelligence sharing arrangement undermines the independence of this assessment at the structural level. The RCMP Security Service, which has been running coordinated surveillance with the FBI against AIM for years, is not a neutral agency relative to the extradition proceedings. It is an operational partner in the same enterprise that produces the extradition request. The institutional relationship between the RCMP and the FBI means that the Canadian state's enforcement apparatus is, in a meaningful operational sense, already committed to the outcome the FBI seeks before the Canadian court begins its assessment. This is not a description of explicit collusion between specific RCMP officers and specific FBI agents in the fabrication of the Poor Bear affidavits. It is a description of a structural context in which the independence of the Canadian judicial process is compromised by the pre-existing operational relationship between the two agencies. This structural dimension of the extradition's illegitimacy is not fully articulated in the Canadian government's 1977 diplomatic protest, which focuses on the specific factual question of the fabricated affidavits. It is a dimension that the 2024 RCMP disclosures make available for the first time in documentary form, and that the full historical accounting of the Peltier case, an accounting that has not yet been written in any official document of either government, will need to address. Event 4. Wounded Knee 1973, The Siege 1973. Wounded Knee is a place before it is an event. It is a creek and a hill in the Pine Ridge Reservation in southwestern South Dakota, and it is the site of the last major massacre of the American Indian Wars, the December 1890 killing by the 7th Cavalry of between 250 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children, most of them unarmed, their bodies left in the winter ground until a blizzard covered them. The site has a mass grave. It has a small church. And in February 1973, it has 200 AIM members and Oglala Lakota residents who have taken it over and declared it the independent Oglala Nation, and who are surrounded by federal marshals, FBI agents, and Bureau of Indian Affairs police. The occupation begins on February 27, 1973, It is organized by AIM leadership, Dennis Banks and Russell Means, in coordination with Oglala Lakota residents who have been attempting for years to address the corruption of the tribal government led by Richard Wilson. Wilson runs the Pine Ridge tribal government with the support of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and, as subsequent documents establish, with significant FBI awareness of the methods he uses to maintain his position. Those methods include a private paramilitary group his opponents call the Guardians of the Oglala Nation, Goons, whose activities include the intimidation, beating, and killing of Wilson's opponents on the reservation. The people who invite AIM to Wounded Knee are not outsiders importing conflict to Pine Ridge. They are Oglala Lakota residents who have been living under a tribal government that functions, in the documented account of subsequent federal investigations, as an instrument of violence against its own constituents. The FBI's response to the occupation is the largest domestic law enforcement deployment since the civil unrest of the late 1960s. 250 federal marshals and FBI agents surround Wounded Knee. Armored personnel carriers are brought in. 50 caliber machine guns are positioned on the perimeter. The occupiers have rifles and a supply network that the FBI attempts to interdict through vehicle checkpoints on the roads into the area. The siege lasts 71 days. 2 occupiers are killed by gunfire during the siege: Frank Clearwater, who is shot on April 17th, and Buddy Lamont, a local Oglala man, who is shot and killed on April 26th. The government acknowledges both deaths. Neither produces a federal investigation into the circumstances of the shooting. The FBI runs a surveillance operation throughout the siege that is explicitly documented in the Bureau's own files. Agents record the communications of occupiers, document the identities of everyone who enters or exits the occupation zone, and compile intelligence files on the AIM leadership and their Oglala Lakota supporters. The files produced during the Wounded Knee siege become the foundation of the prosecutorial campaign against AIM that the Bureau launches in its aftermath. More than 500 people are indicted on charges related to the occupation. Most charges are eventually dropped or result in acquittals. The prosecutions serve their intended function regardless of outcome. They require AIM to divert organizational resources, leadership attention, and money to legal defense for years. The cover of what happens at Wounded Knee is maintained through the official characterization of the occupation as a criminal takeover by an outside organization rather than an expression of the legitimate grievances of the Oglala Lakota community. The FBI's public communications about Wounded Knee present the Bureau's role as the restoration of law and order on federal land against armed militants. The internal communications, the files that document the Goons' activities on Pine Ridge, the Bureau's relationship with Wilson, the surveillance operation against the occupiers, are classified. The picture the American public receives in 1973 is the one the FBI and the Justice Department construct. The truth about Wounded Knee, the full truth, including the FBI's awareness of Wilson's governance through violence, the legitimate community basis for the occupation, and the surveillance and prosecutorial operations that follow it, is not fully established in the public record until the FOIA litigation of the 1980s produces the relevant files. By then, the events of June 26, 1975 have already happened, and the machinery the FBI builds during Wounded Knee is already in use. The occupation ends, the prosecutions begin. Richard Wilson continues to govern Pine Ridge, the Goons continue to operate, and the killing continues at a rate that, in any other context, would produce a federal investigation. The FBI's surveillance operation during the 71 days of Wounded Knee is documented in Bureau files produced through FOIA requests filed in the 1980s and 1990s. The operation is substantial. The Bureau deploys specialized surveillance teams around the perimeter of the occupied area, uses aircraft for overhead observation, intercepts communications between occupiers and their support networks outside the cordon, and maintains extensive files on the identities and activities of everyone observed entering or leaving the occupation zone. The files produced during Wounded Knee become, in the subsequent post-occupation prosecutorial campaign, the foundation of the Bureau's case. Files on individual AIM members and supporters. Among the individuals whose identities are documented in the Wounded Knee surveillance files is Leonard Peltier. He is present at Wounded Knee. He is observed. He is documented. His presence at Wounded Knee connects him, in the FBI's operational picture, to the AIM leadership that the Bureau is building cases against. When Peltier is subsequently identified as a suspect in the Pine Ridge firefight of June 1975, the Wounded Knee surveillance files provide part of the evidentiary foundation for the Bureau's characterization of him as an AIM militant with a documented history of participation in AIM direct actions. The surveillance infrastructure built at Wounded Knee feeds directly into the prosecutorial infrastructure of the post-1975 cases. The armored personnel carriers deployed at Wounded Knee, an image that circulates in the national press during the siege, establish a visual and operational template for the federal government's posture toward AIM that continues through the Pine Ridge period. The government treats AIM not as a civil rights organization engaged in political advocacy, but as an armed insurgent force requiring a military-style containment response. This framing, institutionalized in the FBI's 1972 domestic terrorist designation and operationalized in the Wounded Knee siege, determines how the Bureau approaches the Pine Ridge firefight in 1975, not as a law enforcement incident to be investigated objectively, but as a military engagement with a designated enemy whose members must be prosecuted regardless of the specific facts of what occurs. It does not produce one here. The specific governance structure on Pine Ridge that produces the Wounded Knee occupation is documented in the subsequent federal investigations and in the 1976 U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report. Richard Wilson takes office as Pine Ridge Tribal Chairman in 1972. His administration is characterized, in the accounts of Oglala Lakota residents who testify in federal proceedings and in the Civil Rights Commission investigation, by the systematic use of tribal government resources and personnel against his political opponents. The Goons, guardians of the Oglala Nation, function in practice as a private paramilitary force funded through tribal resources and deployed against Wilson's critics. The FBI's relationship to Wilson's administration is documented in the Bureau's own files and in the testimony of Pine Ridge residents in subsequent proceedings. The Bureau provides Wilson's administration with logistical support, with intelligence about AIM organizing on the reservation, and with a general posture of institutional cooperation that, in the political context of Pine Ridge in 1972 and 1973, constitutes support for one side in a genuine political conflict within the Oglala Lakota community. The conflict is not, in the FBI's framing, a political conflict within an indigenous community between a corrupt administration and its opponents. It is a law enforcement challenge, AIM organizing as a criminal threat, Wilson's administration as the legitimate tribal government. This framing determines what the FBI investigates and what it does not. It investigates AIM. It does not investigate the Goons. It builds prosecutorial cases against AIM leaders for the Wounded Knee occupation. It does not build prosecutorial cases against the individuals responsible for the killings that Wilson's administration is associated with. The political framing is not just rhetorical, it is operational. It determines who is surveilled and who is protected by the FBI's presence on Pine Ridge, and that determination has consequences that compound across the 2 years between Wounded Knee and June 26, 1975. The occupation itself is resolved through negotiations that produce agreements the federal government does not honor. The Nixon administration commits, in exchange for the occupiers' peaceful departure from Wounded Knee, to a White House review of the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, the treaty that guarantees Lakota sovereignty over the Black Hills and other lands that are subsequently taken. The review does not occur. The treaty is not addressed. The occupiers leave. The prosecutions begin. Wilson's administration continues. It does not produce one here. Event 5, The Reign of Terror on Pine Ridge, 1970–1975. The numbers are documented. Between the end of the Wounded Knee occupation in May 1973 and the firefight of June 26, 1975, 64 members and supporters of AIM on the Pine Ridge Reservation are killed. The United States Commission on Civil Rights, in a 1976 report reviewing conditions on Pine Ridge during this period, documents the murder rate and characterizes it as the highest per capita rate of any jurisdiction in the United States during the same period. The report is a federal government document. It is produced by a federal agency. It is in the public record. The FBI investigates none of the 64 deaths. The Bureau maintains a substantial presence on Pine Ridge throughout this period. There are FBI agents on the reservation. There are FBI informants in the AIM community on the reservation. The Bureau is aware of the killings as they occur. The FOIA litigation that produces FBI documents from this period includes internal communications that acknowledge specific deaths and the identities of the individuals believed responsible for them. The individuals believed responsible are, in multiple documented cases, members of Wilson's Goons, the paramilitary organization funded and armed with the knowledge, and the documents suggest, the acquiescence of the tribal government the FBI is supporting through its posture on Pine Ridge. The specific cases are documented in Peter Matheson's In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, published in 1983, and subsequently suppressed through litigation by FBI agents and South Dakota officials for years. Matheson's account draws on FBI documents produced through FOIA requests, trial transcripts, and interviews with survivors. The cases he documents include men who are beaten to death in their homes, women who are shot in circumstances that produce no federal investigation, and individuals who disappear and are found dead in conditions that local authorities record as accidents or undetermined causes. Anna Miakwash is 30 years old in February 1976. She is a Mi'kmaq woman from Nova Scotia who has become one of AIM's most committed organizers. She is found dead on the Pine Ridge Reservation on February 24, 1976. The initial autopsy, conducted by a local coroner, lists her cause of death as exposure. Her hands are cut off and sent to Washington for fingerprint identification. The family demands a second autopsy. A second autopsy establishes that she has been shot in the back of the head at close range. The exposure ruling is a lie. Her murder is investigated eventually, and a conviction is obtained decades later against a former AIM member who claims the killing was ordered by AIM leadership who suspected her of being an FBI informant. The question of the FBI's role in creating the conditions that produced her death, including the specific question of whether the Bureau's disinformation operations contributed to the suspicion that got her killed, is a question the federal investigation does not resolve and does not ask. The cover of the 64 deaths is maintained through the simple mechanism of non-investigation. When law enforcement does not investigate a killing, the killing does not produce a prosecutable case, and the absence of a prosecutable case produces, in the public record, the appearance that the killing cannot be attributed to a responsible party. The FBI's failure to investigate the Pine Ridge deaths is itself the cover-up, inaction as concealment. The mechanism is as old as American law enforcement's relationship to political violence. What the FBI is doing during this period, while 64 people die and no investigation is opened, is documented in the Bureau's own files. It is surveilling AIM. It is managing informants. It is building prosecutorial cases against AIM leadership for the Wounded Knee occupation. It is coordinating with Canadian counterparts on AIM members who travel across the border. It is, by every measure of institutional attention, focused intensely on the American Indian movement. It simply has no attention available for the deaths of the people the American Indian movement is trying to protect. The 1976 Civil Rights Commission report makes this disproportion explicit. The Commission finds that the FBI's presence on Pine Ridge during this period is inversely correlated with the protection of the Oglala Lakota community. It is nominally there to serve, that the Bureau's resources are deployed to suppress AIM rather than to protect residents from the violence they are experiencing. The Commission's specific findings are documented in its 1976 report, which reviews conditions on Pine Ridge across the period from 1973 to 1975, and produces conclusions that are, in the language of a federal government document, as direct a condemnation of the FBI's conduct as the Commission's institutional constraints permit. The Commission finds that the murder rate on Pine Ridge during this period is the highest per capita of any jurisdiction in the United States, higher than any American city, higher than any other reservation, higher than any comparable geographic area. It finds that the deaths are concentrated among individuals associated with AIM and with the political opposition to Wilson's administration. It finds that the federal law enforcement presence on the reservation, which is substantial, given the Bureau's post-Wounded Knee deployment, does not produce a single murder investigation, prosecution, or conviction related to these deaths. The Commission's investigators interview Pine Ridge residents and document specific cases. The accounts they collect describe a climate of fear and political violence that residents navigate daily. The knowledge that association with AIM or public opposition to Wilson's administration carries a risk of physical attack, that the attackers operate with impunity because no law enforcement agency investigates them, and that the FBI, the federal agency with primary law enforcement jurisdiction on reservation land, spends its investigative resources on AIM rather than on the people killing AIM members. The Commission documents this and makes recommendations. The recommendations include federal prosecution of individuals identified as responsible for specific killings on Pine Ridge. No prosecutions follow the report. Richard Wilson serves as Pine Ridge Tribal Chairman until 1976, when he is defeated in a tribal election. He loses to Al Trimble, who runs on a platform of ending the violence and corruption of Wilson's administration. Wilson's defeat does not produce a federal investigation of the goons' activities or of the deaths that occur under his administration. He retires from tribal politics. He dies in 1990. He is never charged with any crime related to the 64 deaths that occurred during his administration's tenure. The Commission's report is in the public record. It names the problem. Nobody in the FBI is held accountable for the 64 uninvestigated deaths. Nobody is charged. Nobody is disciplined. The specific documented cases from the 64 deaths deserve to be named because the abstraction of a number, 64, conceals the specific reality of 64 individuals whose deaths were uninvestigated. Jensita Eagle Deer is a young Lakota woman whose death in 1975 is ruled accidental by local authorities. Her name appears in the FOIA documents produced in the Peltier post-conviction proceedings in the context of allegations about David Price, one of the FBI agents who subsequently obtains the Myrtle Poor Bear affidavits, and his conduct with witnesses on Pine Ridge. The specific allegations about Price in connection with Eagle Deer's case are contested, and the full account is not established in the public record. Her death is in the uninvestigated 64. Byron DeSouza is shot and killed on Pine Ridge in January 1976. He is 22 years old. The shooting is attributed to individuals associated with Wilson's goons. There is no federal investigation. His family testifies before the Civil Rights Commission in 1976. Their testimony is in the Commission's 1976 report. The report is a federal document. The federal government produces a document establishing that federal law enforcement is not investigating the deaths of people on federal reservation land and makes no referral to any prosecuting authority. The report is issued. Nothing changes. Buddy Lamont, the Oglala man killed at Wounded Knee during the 1973 siege, is 26 years old when he dies. His family lives on Pine Ridge. His death during the government's siege of the Wounded Knee occupation is in the official record of the 71-day standoff. No federal investigation of the circumstances of his death is opened. The 1976 U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report does not merely document the murder rate. It documents the FBI's response to the murder rate, which is, effectively, no response. The Commission's investigators review the Bureau's case files for Pine Ridge during this period and find that the deaths of AIM members and supporters on Pine Ridge produce no open federal investigations, no grand jury proceedings, and no prosecutorial action against the individuals whom Pine Ridge residents identify as responsible. The Commission finds this pattern of non-investigation to be itself a form of institutional failure, a federal law enforcement agency failing its legal obligation to investigate major crimes on federal reservation land. Then June 26th happens, and the FBI's response to one day's events produces more federal resources, more prosecutorial energy, and more institutional attention than the previous 2 years of killings combined. Event 6, June 26, 1975, the Firefight on Pine Ridge, 1975. It is the morning of June 26, 1975, on the Jumping Bull property, a compound of houses and outbuildings on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, where several AIM members and supporters, including Leonard Peltier, are camping. The area around Pine Ridge is, by this point, a place where armed conflict is a daily reality rather than a theoretical risk. The goons operate openly. AIM members carry weapons. The 64 deaths of the preceding 2 years have made it clear that being unarmed on Pine Ridge is not a survival strategy. 2 FBI agents, Special Agent Ronald Williams, 27 years old, a former Navy officer from California who joined the Bureau 3 years earlier, and Special Agent Jack Kohler, 28 years old, from Los Angeles, who joined the Bureau in 1973, drive onto the Jumping Bull property in separate vehicles at approximately noon. The official FBI account is that the agents are following a pickup truck they are looking for in connection with a minor theft. What specifically brings them to the Jumping Bull property, and what they do when they arrive, is a question whose full answer is contested between the FBI's account and the documentary record the Bureau's own files produce. What is not contested is the outcome. A firefight breaks out. Both Kohler and Williams are shot and killed. An AIM member named Joe Stuntz Kilswright is also shot and killed during the firefight. His death produces no federal investigation. The FBI launches the largest manhunt in its history to that point for the killers of Kohler and Williams. 4 men are eventually charged: Dino Butler, Robert Robidoux, Jimmy Eagle, and Leonard Peltier. Jimmy Eagle's charges are dropped before trial. Dino Butler and Robert Robidoux are tried first in Cedar Rapids, Iowa in 1976. Their attorneys argue self-defense, that the agents came onto the property in an aggressive manner, and that the people on the property, living in the context of the Pine Ridge Reign of Terror, had legitimate reason to fear for their lives. The Cedar Rapids jury acquits Butler and Robidoux on all charges. Leonard Peltier is not tried in Cedar Rapids. He has fled to Canada. His case is separated from the others. He will be tried alone in Fargo, North Dakota, before a different jury, after a series of events in Canada that represent, in the documented record, one of the clearest examples of federal law enforcement fraud in American legal history. The specific question of what happened during the firefight, who shot Kohler and Williams, from what position, with what weapon, in what sequence, is disputed. The government's case at Peltier's trial rests partly on a ballistics analysis linking a shell casing found at the scene to a rifle associated with Peltier. The AR-15 case is the centerpiece of the prosecution's physical evidence argument. In post-conviction proceedings, the FBI's own ballistics expert acknowledges under oath that the analysis he presents at trial cannot support the conclusion the government draws from it, that the casing definitively links Peltier to the fatal shots. The prosecutor in Peltier's post-conviction appeal process acknowledges to the federal appeals court that the government cannot prove who fired the fatal shots. The government acknowledges this. The government does not concede that the conviction is therefore invalid. It argues that other evidence supports the conviction and that the ballistics issue, while significant, does not constitute grounds for a new trial. The ballistics expert who presents the analysis at trial retires from the FBI. He is never disciplined for testimony that his own employer's subsequent review finds cannot support the conclusions drawn from it. The broader evidentiary picture of the firefight is contested in ways that the post-conviction record documents extensively. The FBI's initial investigation of the scene is conducted under conditions of extreme institutional urgency. The killing of 2 agents mobilizes the Bureau's full investigative apparatus within hours, and the investigation is run with a conclusion already supplied by the Bureau's public and internal communications. Leonard Peltier did this. The investigative choices made in the immediate aftermath of the firefight, which witnesses are interviewed, which physical evidence is collected and how it is handled, which leads are pursued and which are not, reflect, in the accounts of Peltier's defense attorneys who review the investigation files through post-conviction FOIA litigation, an investigation organized to confirm a predetermined conclusion rather than to establish the facts. The specific question of who fires the shots that kill Kohler and Williams is, in the government's post-conviction acknowledgement, not established by the physical evidence. The prosecution at Peltier's trial presents a case built on the combination of the ballistics evidence, witness testimony placing Peltier near the agent's vehicles, and the general narrative of Peltier as the shooter. In post-conviction proceedings, the government acknowledges that it cannot prove which specific individual fires the fatal shots. This acknowledgement appears in the 1985 Eighth Circuit proceedings, in a statement by prosecutor Lynn Crooks that becomes one of the most cited passages in the Peltier case's legal history. Crooks tells the appeals court that, "We can't prove who shot those agents." A prosecutor cannot prove who committed the crime. The conviction stands anyway. The specific formulation that the Eighth Circuit applies in 1985, that even if the ballistics evidence is unreliable, and even if the government cannot identify the shooter, there is sufficient other evidence to support the conviction, is the legal architecture within which Peltier remains imprisoned for the next 4 decades. The architecture is built on the aiding and abetting theory. Even if Peltier does not fire the fatal shots, he participates in the firefight in ways that make him legally responsible for the deaths. This theory is coherent under federal law. It is also a theory that is nowhere adequately argued at trial, because the trial is built on the theory that Peltier fires the shots, a theory the government later acknowledges it cannot prove. Ronald Williams and Jack Kohler are real people who are killed on June 26, 1975. They are 27 and 28 years old. They have families. Their deaths deserve accountability. The question the documented record raises, and that the subsequent 50 years of litigation has not resolved, is whether the man who serves 48 years for those deaths is the man who committed them, or whether the process by which he is convicted is itself a crime. The specific ballistics question that the post-conviction record centers on is worth establishing clearly, because it is simultaneously the most technical and the most consequential element of the documented government misconduct at trial. The prosecution's ballistics argument is this: an AR-15 shell casing found near the bodies of Kohler and Williams is forensically matched by the FBI's own laboratory to a specific AR-15 rifle that is associated with Peltier. If the casing from the death scene matches Peltier's rifle, the physical evidence places Peltier's specific weapon at the specific location where the agents are shot. The October 2, 1975 FBI teletype recovered by attorney Bruce Ellison through FOIA requests in 1981, the document that is not disclosed to the defense at trial, establishes that when the FBI laboratory first analyzes the casing, the results of the analysis are inconclusive. The laboratory cannot definitively match the casing to the rifle. This inconclusiveness is, in the internal FBI teletype, stated clearly. At trial, the prosecution presents the results as probative physical evidence linking Peltier to the fatal shots. The prosecution does not disclose the teletype that establishes the laboratory's own assessment of the results as inconclusive. The expert witness who testifies about the ballistics at trial is Evan Hodge, an FBI laboratory firearms examiner. Hodge presents the ballistics evidence to the jury in a way that the jury can understand as connecting Peltier's rifle to the shell casing found at the scene. In post-conviction proceedings in 1985, Hodge acknowledges under oath that the laboratory tests conducted on the casing and the rifle do not definitively establish the match that the trial presentation suggests. This acknowledgement is in the federal appellate record. It is produced by the government's own witness in a proceeding before the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. The government's response to this acknowledgement is not to acknowledge that the trial is compromised. It is to argue that the ballistics evidence is not the only evidence and that the conviction can be sustained on other grounds. The Eighth Circuit accepts this argument. The conviction stands. The answer to that question begins in Canada Event 7, the Fabricated Affidavits, Fraud on a Foreign Court, 1976. Leonard Peltier crosses into Canada in February 1976, approximately 7 months after the Pine Ridge firefight. He is traveling with a group that includes Frank Blackhorse, who is stopped at the border with a vehicle containing weapons and stolen vehicles, producing charges that complicate Peltier's situation without directly connecting him to the Pine Ridge deaths. Peltier makes it across and settles into the community of Indigenous people in the interior of British Columbia. The FBI knows he is in Canada. The RCMP locates him. The Bureau files an extradition request with the Canadian government in March 1976, asking that Peltier be returned to the United States to face charges in connection with the deaths of Kohler and Williams. Extradition under the U.S.-Canada Treaty requires the requesting government to present evidence to a Canadian court establishing a prima facie case, a basic evidentiary foundation showing that the person sought committed the offense charged. The evidentiary standard is not the full trial standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It is a preliminary threshold. Is there enough to justify the extradition? The FBI presents 3 affidavits from a woman named Myrtle Pourbaix. Pourbaix is an Oglala Lakota woman from Pine Ridge. She is, in the affidavits submitted to the Canadian court, described as Peltier's girlfriend and as a witness to his actions at the Jumping Bull property on June 26, 1975. The affidavits state that she saw Peltier shoot the agents. They are detailed, specific, and, if true, compelling evidence that Peltier was the shooter. The Canadian court accepts the affidavits. Peltier is extradited to the United States in December 1976. After Peltier is in U.S. custody, Myrtle Pourbaix approaches attorneys and says she has never met Leonard Peltier. She says she was not at the Jumping Bull property on June 26, 1975. She says the FBI agents who obtained her statements, agents identified in subsequent proceedings as William Wood and David Price, coerced her statements through a sustained process of intimidation and threat that included threats to her safety and the safety of her child. She says she signed the affidavits under duress and that their content does not describe anything she witnessed because she witnessed nothing. She says she cannot identify Peltier by sight because she does not know who he is. Pourbaix is prepared to testify at Peltier's trial. The trial judge, Paul Benson, rules her testimony inadmissible. He rules it inadmissible on grounds that it is irrelevant and likely to confuse the jury, a ruling that Peltier's attorneys characterize as barring the jury from learning that the government obtained his extradition through fabricated evidence. Peltier is convicted in April 1977 on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He is sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. The Canadian government learns of Pourbaix's recantation through the public record of the Peltier proceedings. In 1977, the Canadian Department of External Affairs, the Canadian Foreign Ministry, files a formal protest with the United States State Department. The protest states that Canada considers the extradition to have been obtained through fraudulent means and that the evidence submitted to Canadian courts does not reflect the truth. It is a diplomatic protest in writing from an allied government to the United States government saying, "You lied to our courts." The United States government acknowledges receipt of the protest. It takes no action. The FBI agents who obtained Pourbaix's affidavits, Wood and Price, continue their careers in the Bureau. David Price is particularly significant in the subsequent record. He is an agent who appears in multiple documented instances of misconduct in the AIM cases on Pine Ridge, including allegations of coercion and other witness statements. He is never charged. He retires from the FBI. He receives his pension. Myrtle Pourbaix's recantation is in the public court record. The Canadian government's diplomatic protest is in the State Department's correspondence files. The acknowledgement by federal prosecutors that the affidavits cannot be credited is in the post-conviction appeal record. These are not disputed facts. They are in the documents. What the documents cannot produce, what 48 years of litigation have not produced, is a federal court willing to say that the fraud that brought Leonard Peltier to trial in the United States voids the conviction that resulted from that trial. The FBI fabricated the affidavits. Canada protested. Nobody was charged. The conviction stood. The specific process by which the Pourbaix affidavits are produced is documented in Pourbaix's own subsequent account, in court records from the extradition proceedings, and in the post-conviction documentation produced through FOIA litigation. Pourbaix describes being approached by FBI agents David Price and William Wood at her home on Pine Ridge in early 1976. She describes a series of meetings in which the agents question her about the Pine Ridge firefight and about her knowledge of Leonard Peltier. She describes the agents showing her photographs and documents and asking her to confirm accounts of events she did not witness. She describes being told, in language she understands as threatening, that her cooperation is expected, and that failure to cooperate will have consequences for her and for her child. The specific mechanism by which her statements become the sworn affidavits submitted to the Canadian court is documented in the differences between three separate statements she provides. The first statement, dated in February 1976, is a general account that does not specifically place her at the Jumping Bull property on June 26, 1975. The second statement, dated later in February 1976, is more specific. It begins to describe events at the firefight scene in ways that suggest eyewitness knowledge. The third statement, submitted as an affidavit to the Canadian Extradition Court, directly claims that she witnesses Peltier shoot the agents. The progression from the first to the third statement is, in the structure that the subsequent legal record establishes, consistent with the specific process of coerced witness statement development that Poor Bear describes, a process in which each contact with the agents produces a statement slightly more specific and slightly more damaging than the last, until the agents have what they need for the legal proceeding they are building toward. The Canadian court accepts the affidavits as submitted, the extradition is approved, Peltier is returned to U.S. custody. The first statement, the vague February 1976 account that does not place Poor Bear at the scene, is not disclosed to the Canadian court. The progression from vague to specific, the process by which the most incriminating statement is produced, is not visible to the Canadian court from the materials the FBI submits. Poor Bear's recantation is thorough and consistent. She maintains, through every subsequent proceeding in which she testifies or provides statements, that she was not present at the Jumping Bull property on June 26, 1975, that she did not witness the events described in the affidavits, and that the affidavits were produced under conditions of coercion and fear rather than from voluntary, truthful recollection. She does not waver on these points. The trial judge bars her testimony from the jury on relevance grounds. The jury never hears from the woman whose fabricated statements are the reason the trial is happening in the United States rather than never happening at all. Event 8. The Trial and the Withheld Evidence, 1977. Fargo, North Dakota in April 1977. The trial of United States v. Peltier opens before Judge Paul Benson. Peltier's attorneys, including William Kunstler and John Privatera, face a prosecution armed with physical evidence, eyewitness accounts from the Jumping Bull property on June 26, 1975, and the institutional momentum of a bureau that has committed every available resource to this conviction. The jury pool is drawn from a North Dakota federal district where the politics and demographics are far removed from the Pine Ridge Reservation and from the context in which the firefight occurs. The prosecution's case has three primary pillars. The first is witness testimony placing Peltier at the scene with a weapon. The second is the ballistics analysis of the AR-15 shell casing found at the scene, the analysis that the FBI's own expert will later acknowledge cannot support the conclusions drawn from it at trial. The third is the general evidentiary picture of Peltier as the person responsible for the deaths, assembled from witness accounts, physical evidence, and the testimony of agents who investigate the firefight. What the defense does not have is the full set of documents the FBI holds about the case. The FBI's FOIA files, the documents that post-conviction proceedings will eventually force into the open, include internal communications that contradict elements of the prosecution's account of the firefight. They include ballistics-related documents that were not disclosed to the defense. They include communications about witnesses that bear on the credibility of testimony presented at trial. The defense does not have these documents because the FBI does not provide them. It provides a subset of its case file. The subset it determines is required under its disclosure obligations and maintains the rest in internal files that the defense cannot access. The jury convicts Peltier in April 1977 on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Benson sentences him to 2 consecutive life terms. He is 42 years old at sentencing. He will not leave federal custody for 47 years. The crack in the trial record opens in 1981. Attorney General William Webster acknowledges in a statement that the government's evidence against Peltier is not as clear-cut as the trial presentation suggests. This acknowledgement does not produce a new trial. The more significant crack opens through FOIA litigation in the early 1980s. Bruce Ellison, an attorney who has worked on AIM cases throughout the decade, files extensive FOIA requests for the FBI's files on the Peltier case. The documents produced include an October 2, 1975 FBI teletype, recovered by Ellison in 1981, that is directly relevant to the ballistics case and that was not disclosed to the defense at trial. The teletype establishes that the FBI's laboratory analysis of the AR-15 casing at the time of the investigation does not produce the definitive match that the prosecution claims at trial. The teletype says, in the FBI's own language, that the results of the test are inconclusive. The prosecution presents the results to the jury as conclusive. The teletype says they are not. The teletype exists in the FBI's files at the time of the trial. It is not disclosed to the defense. In the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals proceedings in 1985, the first major post-conviction appeal, the prosecution acknowledges to the court that the ballistics identification used at trial cannot definitively link the shell casing to Peltier's rifle. The appellate court finds that this acknowledgement is significant. It also finds that the acknowledgement does not reach the legal standard required to overturn the conviction, the standard that requires showing that the evidence, if disclosed, would probably have produced a different outcome at trial. The Eighth Circuit applies this standard and declines to reverse. Peltier remains in prison. The court does not dispute that the FBI withheld evidence. The court disputes whether the withheld evidence is enough to change the outcome. This is the legal framework that holds Peltier in prison through every subsequent appeal, not a finding that the government's evidence is reliable and the conviction is sound, but a finding that the demonstrated misconduct does not clear the specific legal bar required for reversal. The bar requires not just showing that the government cheated, but showing that the cheating changed the result. In a case where the government has cheated comprehensively, fabricated extradition affidavits, withheld ballistics evidence, run a decade-long suppression campaign against the organization, the defendant belongs to proving that any specific piece of misconduct changed the specific outcome is a nearly impossible standard to meet. The FBI agents who participate in the prosecution that withholds this evidence face no disciplinary action. The specific dynamic of the Peltier trial that makes the withheld evidence so consequential is the structure of the prosecution's case without it. Without the October 2 teletype establishing that the FBI's own laboratory found the ballistics results inconclusive, the jury hears Evan Hodges' testimony presenting the AR-15 evidence as probative without any countervailing information about the laboratory's actual assessment. The jury evaluates the physical evidence in a context shaped entirely by the prosecution's presentation. The defense cannot challenge what it does not know exists. The broader context of withheld evidence in the Peltier case extends beyond the ballistics teletype. The FOIA litigation pursued by Ellison and subsequent attorneys produces, across the 1980s and 1990s, a substantial body of material that was not disclosed to the defense at trial. The materials include internal FBI communications about the Pine Ridge investigation that bear on the credibility of witnesses who testify for the prosecution. They include communications about the pretrial investigative process that bear on the reliability of the government's account of what happened on June 26, 1975. They include materials about the general FBI campaign against AIM that provide context for the specific misconduct in the Peltier prosecution. The legal standard that governs the use of this material in post-conviction proceedings is Brady v. Maryland, the 1963 Supreme Court decision establishing that the prosecution must disclose material evidence favorable to the defense. Brady violations, the withholding of material exculpatory evidence, are established grounds for a new trial. The question in the Peltier post-conviction proceedings is whether the withheld materials meet the Brady standards requirement of materiality, whether the evidence, if disclosed, would probably have changed the outcome of the trial. The Eighth Circuit's 1985 opinion applies this standard to the ballistics teletype and finds it not met. The court's reasoning is that the ballistics evidence, while significant, is not the only evidence against Peltier, and that the jury could have convicted on other grounds. This reasoning is legally coherent within the framework of Brady doctrine. It is also the reasoning that allows a conviction, obtained through the withholding of evidence that the government's own expert later acknowledges cannot support the prosecution's claims to stand on the grounds that other evidence might be sufficient. The prosecutorial team that tries Peltier in 1977 and that argues the post-conviction proceedings in the 1980s is never charged with any crime related to the disclosure failures. The lead prosecutor, Lynn Crooks, makes the acknowledgement to the Eighth Circuit that the ballistics case is not reliable and argues for the conviction anyway. He retires from the U.S. Attorney's Office. His conduct arguing for the continuation of a conviction he acknowledges is built on unreliable evidence, is reviewed by no disciplinary body, and produces no professional consequences. The attorney who prosecutes the case, Lynn Crooks, serves out his career as a federal prosecutor. He makes the acknowledgement to the appeals court that the ballistics case is unreliable and then continues to argue that the conviction should stand. He retires. He is never charged with any crime related to the Peltier prosecution. The judge who bars Myrtle Pourbaix's testimony and the verdict of his court stand for 48 years. Event 9, 48 years of APPALS, the legal machinery of an unaccountability, 1977-2024. The post-conviction legal history of United States v. Peltier is, in its own way, a document of what happens when the legal system confronts evidence of its own misconduct and decides that the machinery of finality is more important than the machinery of justice. The appeals span nearly 5 decades. The evidence of government misconduct expands with each round of FOIA litigation. The legal standard for what constitutes grounds for a new trial remains, through all of it, higher than what the evidence can clear. The 1985 Eighth Circuit appeal, the first major post-conviction proceeding, produces the most significant judicial acknowledgement of government misconduct in the case. The Eighth Circuit panel, reviewing the FOIA documents produced by Ellison's litigation, writes an opinion that acknowledges the FBI's withholding of the ballistics teletype and finds that the teletype is material evidence. The court uses language that is, in the context of federal appeals court opinions, remarkably direct. It states that the government's conduct at the trial and on this appeal has been less than exemplary. The panel declines to reverse the conviction, applying the prejudice standard and finding that it is not clear the withheld evidence would have changed the outcome. Judge Gerald Heaney, one of the 3 Eighth Circuit judges on the panel, writes a subsequent letter to the Senate Indian Affairs Committee in 1991 that is not a judicial opinion, but that is, in its candor, more revealing than any judicial opinion in the case. Heaney, a former federal judge, writes to the committee that the United States government overreacted at Wounded Knee, that the FBI's persistent and determined efforts to prosecute Peltier were disproportionate to the evidence against him specifically, and that he believes executive clemency is appropriate. A sitting senior federal appellate judge, writing to the United States Senate, recommends that the man convicted in his own circuit's jurisdiction be released because the conviction is unjust. Peltier applies for clemency multiple times to multiple presidents. President Bill Clinton, who commutes the sentences of scores of people in the final days of his administration in January 2001, does not commute Peltier's sentence. The FBI lobbies against clemency. Agents demonstrate outside the White House. FBI Director Louis Freeh writes to Clinton warning that clemency would be an affront to the law enforcement community. Clinton denies the application. President Barack Obama is asked about the Peltier case multiple times across his 2 terms. He does not grant clemency. His administration's position, consistent with the FBI's institutional position, is that Peltier was lawfully convicted and that the post-conviction proceedings have not established grounds for release. The clemency denials are not based on judicial findings that the conviction is sound. They are based on political calculations, the FBI's institutional opposition to Peltier's release, the law enforcement community's identification of the case as symbolically important, and the political cost to any president of being seen to override law enforcement on a case involving the deaths of 2 federal agents. The FOIA litigation continues through the 1990s and 2000s, producing additional documents that add to the picture of FBI misconduct in the case without meeting the legal standard for a new trial. The documents include additional internal communications about the investigation that were not disclosed at trial, communications about witnesses whose testimony at trial is affected by FBI contact with them, and additional material about the Bureau's general campaign against AIM that provides context for the specific misconduct in the Peltier prosecution. James Reynolds, the former Justice Department official who supervises federal prosecutions in South Dakota during the Peltier trial period, states publicly in 2000 that the case against Peltier should be retried. He says this as a former government official who is familiar with the case from the prosecution side. A former government prosecutor recommends a new trial. No new trial is ordered. The Eighth Circuit hears additional appeals in the 1990s and 2000s. The appeals courts apply the same finality standard. Government misconduct is acknowledged. The legal threshold for reversal is not met. Peltier's attorneys petition the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court declines to hear the case. The specific pattern of the Supreme Court's handling of the Peltier petitions, declining to grant certiorari, the legal process by which the Supreme Court agrees to hear a case, is itself part of the documented record of what the American legal system does with the evidence of its own misconduct. The Peltier case presents the court with an opportunity to address the specific question of what legal remedies are available when a conviction is obtained through documented government fraud on a foreign court. The court declines to address this question. It offers no explanation. Certiorari denials are issued without written rationale. The case that represents the most extensively documented instance of FBI fraud in an extradition proceeding in American legal history does not receive Supreme Court review. The subsequent appeals in the 1990s produce additional documentary disclosures that expand the record of government misconduct without meeting the legal standard for reversal. A 1993 FOIA request produces FBI documents from the pretrial investigation period that include witness interview summaries not previously available to the defense. The interview summaries include accounts that, in the defense's reading, contradict elements of the prosecution's trial narrative about what witnesses see and hear at the Jumping Bull property on June 26, 1975. The Eighth Circuit reviews these documents in 1993 appeal proceedings and applies the same materiality standard, government misconduct acknowledged, legal threshold for reversal not met. The dissenting opinion in the 1993 Eighth Circuit proceedings, written by Judge Gerald Heaney, the same judge whose 1991 letter to the Senate Indian Affairs Committee recommends executive clemency, is the most direct judicial assessment of the Peltier case's fundamental injustice available in the formal legal record. Heaney writes in dissent that the accumulated evidence of government misconduct in the case, viewed in its totality, presents a picture of a prosecution that does not meet the standards of fairness that the American legal system claims to apply. He does not argue that Peltier is innocent. He argues that the process by which the conviction is obtained is fundamentally compromised. He loses the argument within his own court. He writes the letter to the Senate anyway. It is in the record, it belongs there. Peltier develops congestive heart failure in prison. He develops other serious health conditions. His attorneys file for compassionate release on medical grounds. The Bureau of Prisons reviews his applications. Multiple applications are denied. The FBI as an institution continues to oppose his release through the decades. FBI directors write letters. Agents send communications. The Bureau treats the Peltier case as an institutional matter, a question of whether the government will validate the conviction it obtained through documented fraud, rather than as a question of justice. He is in federal custody for 47 years before anything changes. The change does not come from the courts. The clemency campaign for Peltier is, by the 1990s and 2000s, one of the most sustained and broadly supported political campaigns in American criminal justice history. The list of people and organizations who call for his release or a new trial includes, by the time of the 2001 Clinton clemency denial, a former federal appellate judge, multiple members of Congress, multiple foreign governments including Canada and South Africa, Amnesty International, the National Congress of American Indians, dozens of religious organizations, multiple Nobel Peace Prize laureates, and a former assistant United States attorney who worked on the case and subsequently concludes that the conviction is unjust. The FBI's opposition to this campaign is institutional and sustained. The Bureau treats Peltier's imprisonment as a matter of institutional honor. The conviction of the man it holds responsible for the deaths of Kohler and Williams is the resolution the Bureau provides to the families of two agents killed in the line of duty. Reopening the case, granting clemency, or acknowledging the misconduct documented in the post-conviction record would require the Bureau to acknowledge publicly that the resolution it provides is built on fabricated evidence and withheld discovery. The institutional cost of that acknowledgement is the FBI's primary motivation for opposing Peltier's release through every decade of the post-conviction period. The families of Ronald Williams and Jack Kohler are genuine victims in this story. They lose fathers, sons, and brothers on June 26, 1975, and they deserve to know who is responsible for those deaths. The documented record does not establish that Leonard Peltier is not responsible. It establishes that the process by which he is convicted is compromised by fabricated evidence and withheld discovery in ways that, under any honest application of the standards American courts claim to apply, should require a new trial to determine responsibility under conditions that are not tainted by documented government fraud. What the families of Kohler and Williams receive in the form of Leonard Peltier's conviction is not accountability for their loved ones' deaths. It is the appearance of accountability obtained through methods that should undermine its legitimacy. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It requires holding two things simultaneously: that the deaths of Kohler and Williams deserve genuine accountability, and that the process that produces Peltier's conviction does not constitute genuine accountability. Both are true. The documented record requires both. He is in federal custody for 47 years before anything changes. The change does not come from the courts. Event 10, the 2024 release and the reckoning that does not come, 2024. Leonard Peltier is released from federal custody on November 22, 2024. He is 79 years old. He has congestive heart failure. He is released by President Joseph Biden on compassionate grounds, a form of executive action that does not constitute exoneration, does not vacate the conviction, does not acknowledge that the conviction is unjust, and does not produce any accountability for the government officials whose documented misconduct produced it. Biden's decision comes after a sustained public campaign, sustained by indigenous rights organizations, by attorneys who have worked on the case for decades, by the families of other Pine Ridge victims, and by the specific, documented deterioration of Peltier's health in federal custody. The American Civil Liberties Union, Amnesty International, members of Congress from both parties, the Canadian government, and a Nobel Peace Prize letter signed by dozens of laureates have all, at various points, called for Peltier's release. The FBI opposes it until the end. The Bureau sends a formal communication opposing compassionate release. The specific institutional mechanism of the FBI's opposition to Peltier's release is worth examining because it illustrates, in compressed form, the same institutional logic that produces the case against him in the first place. The Bureau's formal communications opposing clemency do not engage with the documented evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, the fabricated affidavits, the withheld ballistics evidence, the acknowledged inability to prove who fired the fatal shots. They argue that Peltier is guilty and that his release would dishonor the memory of Kohler and Williams. This framing converts the question of whether the conviction is just into a question of institutional loyalty. To question the conviction is to dishonor the dead agents. The framing is emotionally powerful. It is also, in its structure, exactly the framing that allows the documented misconduct to remain unaddressed. You cannot acknowledge that the process is fraudulent without appearing to say that the deaths don't matter. The FBI uses the genuine tragedy of Kohler and Williams' deaths as a shield against accountability for what it does in response to those deaths. The Biden administration's internal deliberations about Peltier's case are not fully documented in the public record. What is documented is the timeline. Biden enters office in January 2021 with Peltier's case as a known and politically significant matter. Advocates push for clemency across his term, and the decision to grant compassionate release comes in November 2024, in the final weeks of his administration, after Peltier's health deteriorates to a point where continued imprisonment raises the specific question of whether he will die in federal custody. The compassionate release is not a decision that the administration makes from a position of comfort. It is a decision made under the pressure of a 79-year-old man's failing heart and the specific political cost of being the administration that allows Leonard Peltier to die in prison. The release is granted without the exoneration that would require the government to acknowledge what the documents say it did. This is a deliberate choice. An exoneration, a formal acknowledgement of innocence or of the conviction's fundamental invalidity, would require a legal proceeding that would produce a public record of the government's misconduct. A compassionate release requires only that the administration determine that continued imprisonment serves no penological purpose given the prisoner's age and health. It is the path of minimum institutional exposure. The agent's union issue statements. The institutional opposition of the FBI, an institution whose documented misconduct in the Peltier case includes fabricated extradition affidavits, withheld ballistics evidence, and a decade-long classified suppression campaign, is treated as a legitimate counterweight to the overwhelming evidence that the conviction is unjust. Biden grants the compassionate release. He does not grant a pardon. He does not grant exoneration. The statement issued by the White House does not acknowledge the fabricated affidavits. It does not acknowledge the withheld ballistics evidence. It does not acknowledge the Canadian government's diplomatic protest. It does not name a single FBI agent or prosecutor whose conduct contributed to the conviction. It says that Peltier's release is appropriate given his age and health condition. It treats 48 years of documented government fraud as a background condition that requires no specific accounting. Peltier is returned to his tribal community in North Dakota. He makes a brief public statement. He says he is grateful to be free. He says the fight continues. He is 79 years old and in poor health. He has spent more years in federal prison than he has spent free since his late 20s. The newly declassified RCMP files, surfaced through CBC reporting in 2024, close the loop on the cross-border dimension of the case in ways that add to the documented record without changing the political outcome. The files establish, in Canadian government documents rather than in FBI files or American court records, that the joint FBI-RCMP operation against AIM was real, coordinated, and sustained, that the two agencies were running a joint surveillance and suppression operation against the same Indigenous activist network across two countries. The files establish that the extradition proceedings were not conducted in the good faith legal environment that U.S.-Canada extradition is supposed to operate in, but in the context of a joint intelligence operation against a shared target. The 2024 RCMP disclosures also establish, in Canadian government documents, a dimension of the cross-border operation that the FBI's own COINTELPRO files only partially illuminate. The degree to which the surveillance of AIM in Canada is integrated with the surveillance of First Nations political organizing in Canada itself. The RCMP Security Service's interest in AIM is not purely a function of American requests for assistance with an American fugitive. The RCMP has its own domestic political reasons to surveil Indigenous activists, and AIM's organizing model, community patrols, direct action, confrontational engagement with government institutions, is exactly the model that Canadian First Nations organizations are beginning to adopt in the early 1970s in response to their own government's policies. The joint FBI-RCMP operation against AIM is simultaneously an American counterintelligence operation and a Canadian domestic political surveillance operation, using the same infrastructure to serve both governments' interests simultaneously. This dual function of the joint surveillance operation is the aspect of the story that the 2024 CBC reporting surfaces most clearly. The RCMP files, read in context, document an agency that is not merely assisting an ally with a fugitive search. It is using the AIM surveillance infrastructure to generate intelligence about its own country's indigenous political movements, in a period when those movements are growing rapidly and posing genuine challenges to Canadian government policy on land rights, treaty obligations, and the governance of Indigenous communities. The FBI RCMP cooperation is, in this reading, less a story of Canadian assistance to American law enforcement and more a story of two governments using a shared infrastructure to surveil a shared political threat, one that crosses the border because the communities it organizes also cross the border. The Canadian government does not, in response to the 2024 RCMP disclosures, reopen its assessment of the extradition. It does not file a new diplomatic protest. It does not make a public statement about the connection between the RCMP surveillance files and the fabricated extradition affidavits. It acknowledges the disclosures. It moves on. The FBI agents most directly responsible for the Myrtle Poor Bear affidavits, William Wood and David Price, are long retired and in most cases dead by 2024. The prosecutors who tried Peltier in 1977 with evidence they know is compromised have long since concluded their careers. The judge who bars the evidence that would have told the jury about the fabricated extradition from the record dies in 1998. Nobody is in a position to be held accountable for what the documented record shows they did. The FBI's institutional posture, maintained through every decade of post-conviction litigation, is that Peltier is guilty and the conviction is sound. The Bureau has never, at any institutional level, acknowledged that the Poor Bear affidavits are fabricated. It has never acknowledged that the ballistics evidence is unreliable. It has never acknowledged that the suppression campaign against AIM constitutes misconduct relevant to the Peltier case. It opposes release. It continues to oppose acknowledgement. Ronald Williams and Jack Kohler are real people who died on June 26, 1975. Their families have spent 50 years being told that their deaths have been accounted for by the conviction of Leonard Peltier. If the documented record is correct, if the government cannot prove who fired the fatal shots, if the extradition that brought Peltier to trial was obtained through fabricated documents, if the trial withheld evidence material to the defense, then what their families have been given is not accountability, but the appearance of it. Two men are dead, their killers may or may not have been convicted. The government that convicted the man who served 48 years committed documented fraud to do it, and nobody is accountable for the fraud. That is what the files prove, the files the FBI classified and the files the RCMP has now released, and the files that federal courts have produced through post-conviction proceedings across 5 decades. The story they tell, taken together, is not a contested reading of ambiguous events. It is a documented record of institutional conduct that would, in any other context, constitute crimes. Nobody was charged, nobody will be. The pattern that runs across the 10 events in this video is not a series of isolated decisions made by individual agents who happen to work in the same decade. It is a method. The method has a name, COINTELPRO, and a documented institutional genealogy. The same FBI that runs COINTELPRO against the Black Panthers runs it against AIM, with the same tools, the same informant placement, the same disinformation, the same prosecutorial harassment, and it has a specific purpose that is explicit in the classified field directives. To neutralize political organizations that the FBI's internal leadership considers threats, regardless of whether those organizations have committed crimes the Bureau can charge them with. The specific innovation the AIM campaign adds to the method is internationalization. The RCMP files establish that the FBI extends its suppression operation across a national border, coordinating with a foreign intelligence agency against the same targets in a second country. And when a man the Bureau wants to prosecute crosses that border, the Bureau does not wait for the legal processes of extradition to work as they are designed to work. It fabricates the evidence the legal process requires. It submits the fabricated evidence to a foreign court. It obtains the extradition it needs. And then it watches from inside the American legal system as every mechanism designed to correct what it has done decides that correction is less important than finality. The people who break this open deserve to be named, because this story belongs to them as much as it belongs to its documented crimes. Peter Matheson, who spends years documenting the AIM story in the Spirit of Crazy Horse, and whose publisher faces years of FBI-supported litigation trying to suppress the book. Bruce Ellison, the attorney who spends decades filing FOIA requests and forcing FBI documents into the post-conviction record. Judge Gerald Heaney, who participates in the Eighth Circuit ruling that declines to reverse the conviction, and then writes to the United States Senate to say he believes Peltier should be free. The CBC journalists and researchers who pursue the RCMP access to information requests that produce the 2024 disclosures on the cross-border surveillance operation. James Reynolds, the former Justice Department official who goes public in 2000 to say the case should be retried. And Myrtle Pourbaix, she is alive when she recants. She tells the truth in the public record. The legal system finds her testimony inadmissible and bars it from the jury. She tells the truth anyway. She's the reason the documented record contains the specific fact that is the centerpiece of this story. The FBI fabricated sworn affidavits, submitted them to a foreign court, and obtained an extradition through fraud. That fact is in the record because she put it there. The RCMP officers and analysts who produced the surveillance files, now being released by CBC reporting, deserve a complicated accounting. They are participants in an operation that surveils indigenous activists across 2 countries without public knowledge or meaningful legal oversight, and the files they produce contribute to the operational context within which a fraudulent extradition is executed. They also, by creating records, make possible the 2024 disclosures that add to the documented picture of the joint operation. Records are always double-edged. The surveillance that oppresses also documents. The document that conceals the crime also becomes the evidence of it. The broader lesson this story offers, and it is not a comfortable one, is about the relationship between sovereignty claims and institutional violence. The American Indian movement is founded in 1968 to address the daily, documented institutional violence against indigenous communities in Minneapolis. It is destroyed over the following decade through the institutional violence of the federal government's classified suppression campaign. The organization that forms to demand that indigenous lives be treated as fully human by the institutions of the state is met by those institutions with exactly the contempt it forms to resist. This is not a metaphor. It is in the files. Leonard Peltier is 79 years old and home. Ronald Williams and Jack Kohler are dead. 64 people on Pine Ridge are dead with no federal investigation. Joe Stuntz Kilswright is dead and uninvestigated. Anna Mee Akwash is dead, and the circumstances of her death include a decade of FBI disinformation operations that created the conditions for it. The agents who fabricated the affidavits retired with their pensions. The prosecutor who acknowledged the ballistics were unreliable and argued for the conviction anyway retired to a private life. The FBI, as an institution, has never acknowledged what the documents say it did. There is a document in the Canadian Diplomatic Archives that describes what the Canadian government tells the United States State Department in 1977, after Myrtle Pourbaix recants, and after the FBI's fabrication of the extradition affidavits becomes clear. The document says in the formal language of diplomatic correspondence between allied nations that Canada considers the extradition to have been obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation of material evidence to a Canadian court. It says this to the United States government, in writing, in 1977. The United States government acknowledges receipt. It takes no action. That document is in the diplomatic record of the United States and Canada. It has been in the record since 1977. The American public does not know it exists because the American government does not treat it as requiring a public response, and the classification of the FBI's files makes it impossible for journalists or researchers to connect the diplomatic protest to the specific documented conduct that produces it, the fabricated affidavits, the coerced witness statements, the agents who obtain those statements knowing they are false. Now the record is open enough to tell this story completely. The COINTELPRO files are public. The RCMP files are emerging. The post-conviction FOIA documents are in the legal record. The diplomatic protest is in the State Department correspondence. The ballistics teletype is in the Eighth Circuit record. Everything is there. The question this video ends on is not whether the government did what the documents say it did. The documents say it clearly. The documents are available. The question is what comes next. The question is what you do with knowing it. History is not what happened. History is what we choose to remember, to teach, and to demand accountability for. The rest is what powerful people hope you forget. Don't forget. If this video reached you, share it, subscribe, leave a comment with the event that hit you hardest. Come back for the next one, because there are more.